This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Shashank Kapadia on the show. He is a forward-thinking AI leader that goes way beyond the what when it comes to AI and more about the how and the why. And we always talk about, starting with why and why is so important. So we're going to talk a lot about that today, I'm sure, as we get into this conversation. Anyway, with all that being said, Shashank, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. Thanks for a quick introduction. And excited to speak about AI and the experiences that I can share with your audience today.
Awesome. If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are today and what that journey through tech's been like so we can have some context for our conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, so I've been in machine learning domain for close to 10 years now. And I think my walk in the domain has been pretty much, I wouldn't necessarily say linear, but certainly something where I've navigated through different industry. I started my journey with working at an insurance company, doing a lot of statistical analysis, then moved into a consulting world where working for different clients, optimizing their marketing strategies using data science, machine learning. And for the past 5 to 6 years, I've been working in a product-based companies, again, both Fortune 1, Fortune 500. And so far, my area of focus have been mostly around personalization, recommendation systems, and lately, as everyone talks about it, LLMs, and how essentially we can use these new technologies to not just drive the value for business, which is very critical, but also how, as a new technology leader, can we think about the systems from a scalability standpoint, from an ethics standpoint, from a sustainability standpoint. So yeah, these are all the topics that I get to work on, and I'm very fortunate to be pretty much in the mix of what's driving AI these days.
Awesome. Yeah, those are, really the topics that I think we're most interested in here is kind of how businesses are using these tools and how can we as individual leaders take advantage and use things the right way and not going out of the wrong. But how have you seen people actually take these tools and resources and use them to better themselves?
That's an excellent question, John. And I think there is perhaps at this point no right or wrong answer because it's a space that I think a lot of people and companies, generally speaking, are trying to find and navigate, and perhaps there's a lot of good learnings coming out of that. That being said, I think when we think about these tools, what essentially starts with, in my experience, have worked well so far is you're starting with a use case that you're trying to solve for, right? I mean, yes, there is a lot of scope when it comes to pushing the boundaries, innovating things. And because of that, we are where we are today. But when we think about it from a business standpoint, from an enterprise standpoint, the very first question is, hey, what's the value or what's the problem that we are trying to solve here? Based on what that question or what the answer to that question is when you start to think about, okay, what are some right tools and techniques that we can use? So to me, when I look at some of these new tools that are hitting the industry, it's a lot more about, hey, 5 years ago, we had this problem and we were trying to solve that with X and Y tool or a new technology. Nowadays, we have this new tool in our arsenal. Can that tool be used more effectively and efficiently to solve the business problems? That's one side of the story. The other side is also coming out with new features altogether that perhaps were either not within the reach or out of scope before we had these tools that are available to us today. A good example of that comes to mind would be like, hey, we have working within the personalization domain, there is a lot of emphasis on trust and explainability of your results. And while a lot of companies were trying to figure that piece out, with the new tools that are available to us through LLMs, the explainability component has become a lot more easier to add as a new feature. So taking a step back, when you ask this question, how do we integrate these tools or how one should start to think about it? I think it essentially boils down into two kind of buckets in my head. One is if there is an existing problem that you're trying to solve for, is there a tool available that is a right fit for that? And if that is, what does that roadmap looks like? And there are these new features that altogether opens up a new scope for a business to think about. And with these new tools, can those new features be pushed to market quite easily, which wasn't the case 5, 10 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. I love the fact that you're talking about having a actual question first, like having what is the outcome going to be? And, kind of beginning with that end in mind of how you're going to get to a certain point, and then, what's available today that wasn't available in the past to get us there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, again, there's a lot of potential and value when it comes to uh, getting research done. And there is certainly a scope that even within companies, there is a good allocation to it. Like I said, again, this domain itself is very quickly evolving. And so you certainly want to put some time into running different POCs, different experimentations. But how do you balance that along with the production work, pushing new features into the market? Different companies have different checkpoints and balances for that. But again, they both go hand in hand as we navigate through this uncharted space.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to like the usage of different tools that are out there, what are some of the things we need to think about when it comes to responsible use?
Yeah, and I think when you think about responsibilities, I'm assuming and thinking you're kind of hinting more towards the ethical consideration.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's a great question. And again, it's one of those things where it's taking shape as we discuss these things, because it's relatively new from a lot of different perspectives. Now, the way I tend to think about it would be when we think about ethics, when we think about a responsible solution, um, not every solution that we use LLMs for are consumer facing. There are a lot of applications that we use internally that can help boost the productivity. For example, at the end of the day, we have started to use LLMs to help us with our coding work. That being said, when we think about ethics, at least in today's world, it's a lot about how some of these tools are used for consumer-facing applications that we have in production today. And the really good way to start to think about it is what's driving the outputs from your LLMs and what use case are you using these LLMs for? When we think about LLMs, or for that matter, any machine learning solution, I like to think about it as you are essentially scaling all of your historical information that has been used to train these models, and you're scaling it 100x or 1000x. What I mean by that is a very simple use case, if you were to think about it. If, as a recruiter, I am scanning all the resumes that have come in for a job that I have open, there is a single human evaluating these resumes, finding which fits, which not fits. And so it's the single person's biases that may have come into play when that selection happens. Now, when you train the model to be able to run it on your resume screening process, you have essentially replicated from one human making decision to perhaps 100 humans or 1,000 humans, depending on what that scale looks like. So the very real question comes into play is the models that have been used or are being used, what data is essentially feeding into training these models? That's one side of ethical consideration that we have to take into account. Now, when it comes to responsibility, a part of it also is, well, we are never going to get 100% accurate, but what's really important is building the trust and being transparent about things. So especially when you are, let's say, recommending certain things to a certain user. A good example is in today's day, when you watch a YouTube video and the ad is being shown to you, there's usually this info tape that shows you why this ad is being served to you. So yes, there could be biases, there could be a lot of data that has went into it, both personal as well as general information. But as we try to be more responsible, a part of that is building the trust with your consumers. So knowing why am I getting served certain information, be that in the form of an ad or a recommendation, is a step towards making a solution a bit more responsible. But again, when we think about it from a policy standpoint, when we think about it from a framework standpoint, it's still very much work in progress. And I think as we can be more cautious now, it's going to help us steer this in the right direction for years to come.
So let's talk a little bit about like where are we when you talked about like where the LLM's data is sourced from, are we talking more like scraping things off the internet that may not be legal to do that, or maybe it's legal but it's not ethical, or using PII data that you may store in house and keeping this all internal, but using that information to make decisions, or kind of what are you talking about when it comes to that aspect?
I think so. There are quite a few questions.
I just want to understand kind of where we're going. My thoughts are on this because I can see advantages from both directions, but I'm not sure like what the ethics are behind that.
Yeah, I think so. Part of it is, again, I think there are perhaps a couple of questions to, or a few questions layered into that simple question itself, right?
Okay.
And to be honest, it's again a domain that many people are answering from a different perspectives. And me personally, not being a lawyer, I cannot necessarily speak to the legal considerations, but I can certainly see how some of these things are unfolding. I think when we think about it from using a lot of open source data that's available out there, again, a few years back, perhaps at least as how a common users, we weren't necessarily aware about the scale of scraping that's happening. It could have been happening for years and for different reasons. But now I think we have been more exposed to how a lot of this data have been scraped and have been used to train the large language models. So there are two sides to it when we think about it from an ethical and a legal standpoint. The legal standpoint is have that data being scraped using information that could be deemed as a copyrighted information. And the definition of what copyright stands for in itself is a bit up in the air, right? You see a case where ton of information have been scraped from platforms like Reddit. Again, where as a user, you're sharing all your opinions, your thoughts about different things on different subreddits, and the data have been scraped. Now, was that a copyright infringement? What does that term of use looks like from a Reddit perspective? Who owns those comments? Who owns the data? So it gets a bit layered question from a legal standpoint when it comes to having used that data to train the large language models. Now, the second part of it, when we think about it from an ethics responsibility side, is also taking a step back to our previous discussion, right? The models are getting trained on the information that's available out there. And when we say the information available out there, the information could be both good and bad in terms of how it steers the human perception going forward. So one could argue that, hey, end of the day, what we are seeing from a model is how humans have interacted in the past. But the real question is not so much about whether these models are accurate or not, because how closely they represent the information from the past. It's a lot more about, is that the direction that we want to have like a closed loop feedback into, which is like, hey, okay, the perceptions for decades have been wrong. That's fine. Do we still use that and feed that back into the system? Or at some point, do we say certain things are ethically correct, morally incorrect, ethically incorrect, and try to steer that? And that kind of domain in itself right now is a very big question mark. To be honest, there's no right or wrong answer to that. but we know this is a challenge that needs to be resolved.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where I think we're going to get better with it over time. Just like, you look at the evolution of the internet and the other ways we've got information, we've gotten better with that over time as a species, as we've learned how to use tools and what the ramifications of certain things are. I think we just in turn, improve upon it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from an ethical standpoint, I think what I have been sort of looking into lately, and I've shared that in my past experiences as well, is what I call to be like an ethical AI framework. Again, it's like, think of it as all these different components that one has to take into account. And while these questions are very open ended and there is not something that we can get an easy answer to, we can certainly start taking steps towards it. And I'm sure the audience listening would find some of this kind of a blueprint helpful. So when I think about ethical AI, and especially coming in more from a technical background, I like to put that into a framework. I think at the very base of that framework, what you probably as an enterprise would want to have is a data stewardship layer. Again, you want to make sure that there is an ethical collection, processing, as well as privacy preserving techniques for the data that you are going to use at your enterprise. The second layer is on top of it is your model and training layer, where, hey, are we integrating fairness and privacy constraints directly into the model training in itself? On the on top of it, you have an evaluation and validation layer, which is very important. So not only quantitatively are we qualitatively verifying the adherence of your privacy, fairness, and explainability standards before even the model gets essentially deployed. And once the model is deployed, comes in that layer where you have a deployment and an operational layer, where your emphasis is not just on the scalability of things, but as more and more users starts to consume the outputs from the model, can we collect that information to understand if your models are digressing from what your standards have been, and are constantly using that information to tweak and adjust your model. And then on top of it, which is kind of an umbrella where you have a lot of cross collaboration and a space which doesn't move very fast, but it's very important for us to have, is a governance, compliance, and an oversight layer where everything that you've done up until this point, a lot of those things are technical. But then once you have that, does it aligns with the global regulations and the ethical principles, while also can support a continuous auditing if needs be? Again, the another area that I think we haven't touched in our discussions is we have a very, I would say, distributed global regulations as it sits today. EU has its own set of regulations that
Right.
when it comes to using AI. In US, we don't have a centralized regulation, but we do have state-wise regulations that's still a bit work in progress. So when we think about that, a compliance and a governance oversight layer, while quite vague from a technical perspective, it's a very critical component to this framework as well.
Yeah, it seems like I guess my opinion would be like the best approach would be to find like the most restrictive set of regulations that are out there and try to adhere to those. That way you can fall in line with, all the others, because there are a lot when it comes to, what California is doing, what Texas is doing, and then what, the EU is doing, and trying to make sure you accommodate everything can be challenging.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly one strategy I think companies would want to adopt, which is, let's pick the strictest one that kind of build our solutions around it. Um, there are certainly balances, and perhaps I would call it trade-offs, that companies are trying to balance when it comes to that, right? So when we think about the objective of our solutions, being ethically and from a regulatory standpoint compliant is one in the metrics. The other side of things are also when it comes to using the solution to generate revenue or generate profits. Part of it is also user satisfaction. Part of it is also, and speaking strictly from a machine learning standpoint, is the accuracy. So I like to think about it as sort of a triangle where each vertices and speaking it from like a recommendation engine standpoint, for example, on one of the vertices, you have personalization. Is our model that we are putting into production enhancing the engagement that we expect and the satisfaction of our users who are consuming that? The second side is around the fairness, where is our solution excluding any biases to propagate as an output? And the third is what I call to be privacy and regulatory compliance. So, do we have the right safeguards to the sensitive user information? Are we really using sensitive information of users to build our systems? And is system regulatory compliant? And when we think about the solutions are not getting deployed in one region or one country. Many large scale tech companies are deploying their solutions globally with the global consumer base. So having one strict strategy where we can be very strictly compliant to the most, I would say, strictest rule that's out there is a start to it. But oftentimes you're trying to balance some trade offs. And with some lenient regulation, it helps you create a slightly more accurate models. Again, the question would be with that additional accuracy, is it helping business or is it not helping business in the short and the long term? So again, a lot of these questions are, I would say, a bit more layered than perhaps a black and white situation. So it's a bit gray when it comes to that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, Switching gears a little bit away from kind of the regulation side, let's talk a little bit about, just agents and autonomous systems and kind of where we are today when it comes to the use of that and how can individual tech leaders start applying the concepts of agents and autonomous systems into their daily workflows and their routines.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. Now, I know different people have different perspectives on the agents itself, and what agents are to begin with is a question that perhaps the definition of it is quite up in the air, right? So from one end, you can think of agents as just an automated workflows. Or the other end of it, which I think I lean more towards, are agents are not just helping you automate your workflows, but they are also playing a decision-making role as they automate the workflow. And that's what differentiates an automated workflow towards an agentic workflow, where you are delegating some of your decision-making onto agents as well. So see the role that the autonomous agents will play in enterprise AI, I see that, or I see them to be essentially the UX of an enterprise AI. So instead of building hundreds of custom workflows, you build agents that can reason, that can adapt, and that can act across your system. So it's not about replacing necessarily people. It's about giving teams the leverage to enhance their productivity and their workflow. So we're just getting started, and I think the space will redefine how software gets built for years to come.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We are just now figuring that out for sure. What tools do you recommend that leaders start to use if they're just now getting started with learning about using AI? Maybe they've heard about ChatGPT, they've tested it out a little bit. What do you recommend, especially in the software side?
Yeah, there are quite some excellent tools that are out there. I think when we think about it from an agentic standpoint or building what you call a workflows in itself,
Mhm.
just to name few from an open source standpoint, if you're just getting started, the easy one to pick would be a LangGraph or a LangChain, right? So it's an API-based tool that can allow you to plug in your different open source model or custom models out there, and you can build an as simple of an application as you want it to be. So I think when you start to think about playing with an agents, end of the day, your agents are doing certain series of work. So you want to start with something of a single, I would say a single focused work. Pick a framework that's open source. Again, LangChain is relatively good. It has been uh, widely used in an industry, quite widely adopted, and very easy to onboard with the great documentation that they have in place.
Mm. Yeah. Um, where, when you're looking at like deploying something like this out for a team, how would you go about like policies and standards for companies or businesses, and should businesses be putting in different policies when it comes to AI in general, like use policies, how to use it, what tools are allowed, what's not allowed, what data is allowed, and what's not allowed, and things like that.
Yeah, I think there are few layers to unravel within that question itself. So
Yeah.
uh, I think so. Part of it, from a data standpoint, I think yes. Generally speaking, again, whether some of these tools are being built for internal productivity boosts or other something that the consumer is going to face eventually, that essentially would define the governance model of what data goes into that. The second aspect of it also is, as we start to think about deployments of LLMs, um, well, there are certain differences when it comes to your DevOps or CI/CD process as you deploy the solution, but a lot of foundational things would still hold true, meaning as you deploy the solution in production, you want to make sure that you are building it on top of right abstractions early on. So when you're moving on from a demo to a deployment, you're not just scaling your infrastructure, you're scaling your trust, you're scaling your observability, you're essentially your iteration velocity. So with LLMs and agents, it's about creating the systems that can evolve safely over time while you can still continue to ship really fast the value that you're trying to drive. Now, what differs slightly, I think, is also perhaps we think about it as a human in loop evaluation, because end of the day, when we compare this with a conventional software or to some extent conventional machine learning solutions, they are what we call to be a deterministic systems, right? So when you build a software, you exactly know when you give a certain input, what an output is. So you can have a good amount of automated testing that you can set up to make sure there are good guardrails around it before a solution itself is getting deployed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to LLMs, you are dealing with probabilistic models. So every time you can give an input, your output can be slightly different. So it makes evaluating your systems a bit tricky. And your input itself is not controlled, right? So we think about ChatGPT. Users can input whatever they would want to input. And sometimes you don't know how your model is going to react. So that's why having a right human in loop evaluation, and again, in today's world, there is no right solution to making sure you are 100% safely guardrailed. But you still want to have that evaluation in place as thorough as you can before the solution itself is getting out. And there are quite a few different approaches that have been used or are being used, be that to how you can engineer your prompt engineering side of things to have like a safe guardrails, to fine tuning your LLMs on different data sets that you want your models to perform in a certain way. So a lot of different approaches are being used today. But coming back to your question itself, I think when we deploy and scale, a lot of original principles would still hold true. But on top of that, given the probabilistic nature of it, there are the slightly additional things that we would want to take into account when we deploy the solutions at scale.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, not to discount the infrastructural need itself is a whole new ballgame when we try to deploy the solution at a global scale.
Yeah, for sure. I think when it comes to like business use and leadership use, when it comes of having an LLM of some sort, there are lots of options, and I think that's kind of what we're saying right now. Is there's a lot of things out there, and there's a lot of ways to do it whenever you're going to deploy it out. But from my perspective, I think one of the important things is just to start. Right, you've got to start somewhere. So find a place, find a solution, or an outcome that you want to have, a result in. Determine what your vision is for that to happen, and then how can you start in that direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great point, John. And I think to that extent, there's no sight at this point that the model training process, and I mean the foundational models that are being trained and put out in the market, is gonna slow down anytime soon. Although we are hitting the limit in terms of what's data or what amount of data that's available out there that can be used to train this model. So a lot of when we think about the journey of foundational models, early on in the stages, there is a lot of open source data that we briefly touched upon is available out there on internet that can be fed into training your models. But we are getting to the stage now where there may not be enough data. And not just that, the data that we are using to train our models in today's age, we don't know if that data itself is an AI generated data or a human generated information. So we are getting to the point where we are hitting the ceiling of how much data is available to fed into the models. But now the focus has been a lot more on the post training assets, or perhaps once we have the output, how we can further tune it to improve its smartness. And there's a whole thing going on when it comes to the pushing the boundaries from an AGI standpoint.
So tell me a little bit about that. When it comes into like running out of data or having, what is the risk or fear of having, AI generated data fed back into the model? Does that corrupt the model? Is it kind of like, reducing the effectiveness?
I wouldn't necessarily say reduce the effectiveness or corrupt. I think it's a lot more about a very fundamental question, which is why are we trying to train a new foundational model to begin with? And part of it, as we think about it, is to make the models be smarter. I think you may have heard that discussion quite often online, which is, hey, we have this version of model. Like if you think of GPT-3, okay, the GPT-3 model is as smart as, let's just say, for example, a 5th grader. Then came a GPT-4 and 4.0 and so forth and so on. And not just from a OpenAI standpoint, Google has their Gemini series, Meta has their Open or Llama series. But all of these models, as they iterate from one version to another, the goal is how we can make these models be smarter. Now, if you are feeding the output from a previous generation model into your system to somehow make the model be smarter, that becomes a bit of a challenge for you to solve, right? Because the output itself has come out from a model that is not as smart as the model that you're trying to train. So new set of information that you can fed or feed into the model that has not been seen before sometimes can help. But again, that's just one side of the puzzle. The other side is there have been a significant amount of research that has gone into post-training. Like you think about it from a deep seek model standpoint, one of the reasons it was a very successful model is that it was able to leverage a lot of open source foundational model parameters and weights that have already been out there in the market. And then on top of that, I don't want to say it loosely, but perhaps fine tune that to an extent to make a model a bit more smarter. So now it's not so much about how much more data we can feed in. Yes, there's always a hunger for that, but a lot of research has gone into the post-training side, the techniques side of how the models themselves are getting trained. So it's not so much as the corrupted data or noisy data. Yes, there's certainly an aspect to that, but it's also more about not having a vicious cycle that the data that has been churned out of the model is now fed back into the model to just somehow make them smarter by retraining it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Cause I was thinking like, if you take, something that, is AI generated that may have some, incorrect facts and feed that back into the model, you're eventually going to get to a false narrative of what's not really true.
Yeah, and there is certainly a risk for that as well, John, right? I mean, we have seen those nuanced scenarios posted online about what kind of outputs we get from the models themselves, and sometimes the factual information aren't correct. So using that is certainly a part of risk itself, which is, are we feeding the right information it to begin with?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think this has been very fascinating and a great conversation. I really appreciate you sharing all this information with us and helping us learn a little bit about the ethics and the future of the models and what's happening with this data coming in and how we're hitting that limit of information we can feed in. But again, it's still growing. We're still in the early stages of all this. How can people connect with you online, learn more about what you're doing, and just reach out if they have any questions?
Yeah, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I definitely am more than happy to connect with people who would want to discuss this more. Again, there's a lot of learning that I can have with people I connect to as well. So, yes, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn, drop me a message. If you happen to be local, I always am open to having a quick cup of coffee and having a discussion over that as well. So, happy to stay in touch.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has as well.
Yeah, likewise, John. I think it was a great discussion to talk about a lot of different topics that are a burning subject these days. And I hope your audience finds this to be useful and have some insights coming out of this discussion.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.